Ashley, you're muted.
Normally a lot better at that. Today, for some reason, I keep going to, maybe my trackpad's going.
I figured this was an accessibility exercise where we were trying to do it without audio.
That would be good. Cover that up. See how difficult that was.
Yeah.
All right. So recently we went and did a round of another round of accessibility updates for a suite of client sites. And so we just wanted to share some of the different things that we did, that some of them are very Drupal-y and some of them you could apply to any website. So we're just going to kind of casually discuss and talk through those today. So the first one that we're going to talk about is a very Drupal-y thing, but has global applications. We're just going to show a kind of a Drupal way to go about doing that, and that is external links. So external links with accessibility, you need to be telling all of your users in some fashion that you're going to be leaving the website. So in some cases, you know, for sighted users, just an external link icon has a fairly universal understanding by now. But then people with screen readers, they might not know what that means. So you need to also have screen reader text that will tell them that they are leaving the site. So we, being Drupal, we didn't want to have to make people have to manually manage that, since you can't count on everyone to be good content admins. So we wanted to figure out the best way to programmatically do that. So Haley and I think Jonathan actually helped come up with this solution. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little, Haley.
Maybe you can start by talking about what the outcome, what you would want the outcome to be and why, like what the ARIA attributes do.
Sure. So I guess outcome is kind of right here. We, in this case, wanted to provide ourselves with a means to add a visual indicator and a screen reader text that lets people know it opens in a new window, in this case, looking for things with a blank target. So there's different types of things you can do. Some people are actually looking more explicit with external links. So they'll tell you if it's opening in a new window, or they might give you a separate type of alert that says you are now leaving this website, just so you know. Because it's not always obvious to people with screen readers that, hey, they left, you know, this site.com and ended up on that site.org. So, and some people have that text visible and some people do not. There's a little bit of open to interpretation, as in people haven't yet decided the definitive this is the way, but there are recommended things to do, and this does fall within those parameters at least.
Well, do you want me to kind of explain what this is doing a little bit now?
Sure.
Cool. So this is just a link alter function that we put in just a custom module. And what this does is it looks for any link that is either in like a link field or menu links. So basically any link that gets added via the Drupal system, basically. And it checks to see if that link attribute has a target blank or if it's an external URL. And if either one of those things is true, then it overrides the link text. And in this case, it's just adding basically just appending this span with the external link icon with that ARIA label. So this will run on this will happen for every link field, menu link on the site. So just one universal way to override all of those links without having to do any extra content editing work.
Mhm.
And it took us a while to find this place to inject this. And I think we're pretty happy with the implementation, with the exception of this part right here.
Mhm.
In order to put text in, to replace that text that the link has, you can't give it a string, because if you give it a string, it will escape it. So we needed HTML in there. So it needs to be text that is marked as safe to prevent anything from, getting in there. And one of the ways of doing that is the translation system, but this isn't really the best use of the translation system. Really, we should only be translating the text opens in a new window. So this was the best we could come up with on we were on a pretty short time frame, but if we're going to generalize this, we'd like to come up with I think the right solution is to put this through a twig template. It was just that was going to be a little more heavy lifting, but if we get that done, this might be a general solution we can put other places too.
Yeah.
So John, I've come across needing to use some of the functions on the HTML class, but I don't think those are safeifiers, not like marking something as safe, right?
Yeah, there's specifically the output of T isn't a string. It is a class called
Right.
formatted markup, I think, something like that. So it has to be a class that has a particular interface on it, I believe.
Did you look at those functions in the HTML class, or like to see if there was something in there that would mark it as safe?
Yeah, there are some things that can be done. But basically all what they're doing is producing something of that formatted markup class. It's just a matter of trying to be, if we want to do something that's reusable, it's pretty clear from the documentation that the intended way to do this is with a twig template. It was just that was too many pieces for us to put together in a short period of time.
And is this something that gets is part of the link rebuilding process, or is this something that would get called every time a page is rendered that had a link on it?
This would be called when the L function is called, or the equivalent object-oriented thing. So basically anytime a link is generated, but a lot of those are cached. So yes, it is called a lot, and you wouldn't want to do anything that was particularly involved, but the cache should help. Ashley, is there any reason you can think of that this would not be something that you'd want to do on every link of this type?
I think it depends on how good this evaluation is. I mean, generally you shouldn't go to target blank if you are going to a link that's still within your same website. But if it's looking for a link that is technically internal but looks external, that could be kind of giving you just I just wouldn't open in a new window in that case. I think the biggest thing is probably people sometimes wanting to differentiate the message between something that's target blank versus something that's truly external, like warning them they're leaving the site versus just warning them it's opening in a new window. I mean, I suppose another use case could be if someone has subsites that are just improperly evaluated as internal, external. But in most cases, you'll want to do something, and I think it's at least a good programmatic foundation. So the exception here would be WYSIWYG links, which we'd have to come up with a different solution for actually adding the span text and such. But we could use target blank to still add an icon. So this was just like a quick awesome example placement of adding an icon to that class, but you could add like an SVG or whatever works that with your site aesthetics. So just not getting too crazy with that, because icons are something that are you want to make something that is universally recognizable. And external link is kind of on the list of ones that a lot of people recognize, like home and print, etc. So if you make something too fancy, it won't actually be helpful. And in that case, you would want your opens in new window text to at least show up on hover and focus, if not just being there all the time. But in this particular case, it's a screen reader only. So, but we could change that if we needed to. So another thing that we did, this is not necessarily Drupal specific. We've implemented this within Drupal sites. So in these examples that we're going to share here, it has to do with just how we've rendered like a twig template, things like that. So kind of feeding in your fields into the appropriate structure. So a little introduction to prefers reduced motion. It's a media query that's gained a lot of support over the last couple of years. It's pretty widely supported now. And it looks at not at a browser setting, but at your operating system settings. And that is what they will use to turn off a lot of animations you might even see within your general OS that a lot of websites currently ignore, which means that a lot of these people are actually getting their own browser extensions that are forcing turn-offs of animations, which can cause breakages depending on how you've done your implementation and how that extension chooses to turn off said animation. So prefers reduced motion is a way to give us a lot better control over the differences between animated and non-animated content. And then in general, we want to make sure that our base site is actually the non-animated version. It's more inclusive. It's going to tend to be less lines of code to have the base be that, and then adding animation for no preference users versus having your default be animated and then overriding that with people who have it set to reduce. So this is just a CSS example of how you would use that. Just putting it inside no preference instead of having that be a default and putting and then stripping animation out into a prefers reduce motion reduce. So I don't even have to have anything that strips this out if I put it in the no preference media query. So that's kind of the basics of the CSS, but it also has, we can also look at that setting with JavaScript, and there's certain things we can use in HTML. So this is a JavaScript example. And so this was for background video. So background video is kind of, it's not uncommon for clients to request a background video banner or something like that, that unfortunately is usually going to autoplay on a loop. So at the very least, we want to be able to pause these, which we did in a previous accessibility remediation round. This time around, we actually added prefers reduce motion. And so what we're looking at, this is a Vimeo background banner. So we declared like a poster and background image, and then the actual source within the video. I don't really know why the colors are so faded here. We'll have to look at that. But then what we're looking at with that is we're actually doing conditionally different things on window match media and then looking for that specific media query. So in this particular case, we're presenting the static image by default, but then it prefers reduced motion is no preference. Then the video will play and they will see the play pause buttons. So I think I explained that correctly, Haley. If it's doing something different, you can let me know.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It just starts out paused, and if it, exactly like you said, if the user doesn't prefer reduce motion, then it just triggers that play function, and then the video plays.
So yeah, this line right in here, window match media prefers reduce motion, is the key for our conditions. So any other types of animation that you may be doing, like parallax effects or fancy entrance animations, you would definitely want to consider putting those inside an if statement with something like this, so that it's checking that they don't have that setting changed to reduced before it does it, and if it does, not doing it. So kind of the JavaScript thing to be looking at. And so this animated GIFs example is another way in like HTML. So we have a picture element, and in this, there's a source set here of the GIF that is looking for media to be no preference. And then the base one is the static image. So once again, looking for a no preference setting to do the fancy thing instead of overriding the fancy thing with a simpler thing.
Yep.
So those are just a few kind of the CSS, JavaScript, and HTML ways to be that you can utilize prefers reduce motion and introduce it to your site. So those are definitely more globally applicable and kind of theme level. But if you're building something out like this, you can do a twig template. We do have a twig template. I just didn't show the template here. This is more of what the output would be. But our clients are able to just add, I think, their poster image and their share link of their video, and everything else is done through Drupal and JavaScript styles. So another one that's more globally applicable is focus visible. This may or may not jumpstart another discussion on WCAG, since there's going to be some big developments on that front. But focus visible was previously level AA. So for people who don't know, there's A, critical, AA, very important, and AAA, which is more of a nice to have, but I mean, still important, but usually for people who have a greater likelihood of disabilities in their user groups. So, but WCAG 2.2 is in draft form and on track to launch this summer. And that promotes focus visible, which basically means you have to have a visible focus style. That is promoted from important to critical. And they've introduced focus appearance, which basically means your focus indication can't be too subtle. It must have high enough contrast and visibility, not only in contrast with the element that's being focused, but its background. So
Is this
this
a
is one of my,
case of something where if you didn't do anything to break it, the default would already be accessible, or is this something that's required as an enhancement in CSS?
The default is usually accessible. It's just like the default like blue glowing ring for Mac.
So it
Yeah.
would depend on colors, probably.
Probably,
Yeah.
yeah.
This is where I think browsers are still playing catch up, is the contrast issue. Right now with 2.1, which is where we're at now, the default focus ring, whether it's, you know, the dotted black line or the blue glow ring, you know, depending on what browser you're in, that is sufficient according to 2.1. But if you have a banner with a blue background and then you have a blue focus ring, you can barely see that in some cases. So with the increased contrast guidelines that we know are coming, we want to try to adhere to those going forward so we stay on top of things. So the thing that we don't want to do, which you see on too many sites, is people just turning off the focus appearance. Huge pet peeve. And if you tab through a site, you won't see anything anywhere. Your site will just magically jump and scroll. But a user who is relying on keyboard navigation, so this could be someone with low vision, color blindness, or people with motor impairments who are using some kind of switch device, but don't have full capability of scrolling and clicking. That's like an unusable experience for those people.
And I
So
think people would do this, like turning off the focus styles, because they don't like how it looks when you like click a link and it gives you that glowing ring. So people just turn it off, but the focus visible thing hopefully helps with that, because it only shows up on keyboard focus instead of like if you just click a link, it focuses it.
yes, so
I just want to add, you know, I use keyboard navigation sometimes, just especially like when you're filling out forms, and this is something that annoys me, and I have perfectly fine vision.
yeah, definitely. So, and I think a lot of people turn it off too because they don't like that different browsers have very different focus appearances that are their defaults. But what we really need to be doing is taking this as an opportunity to extend the design, the website and brand into these interactive states. So there is a focus -visible thing that you can do for CSS, but I don't think Safari and some like Android, it doesn't have nearly wide enough support for that to be the only thing that we use. And some of the things that annoy people, as Haley said, are you click something like a button and it's going to have its focus style, but you don't want it to have its focus style for click users. It only makes sense for keyboard users. So we've started using a polyfill. So I have a link in here that we'll post eventually. So, but you can Google different focused visible polyfills. So that's going to actually help you with detection of whether or not you're clicking or using keyboard navigation. And it gives us, the one that we use gives us a class. And with that class, we're able to control the focus style of different kinds of elements. And we've also gone further and changed the color of the focus based on the background of what we know is going to be there, or even what the foreground element is. So we're making sure that we're passing contrast ratios no matter where the focus is. And I think another trap that you don't want to fall into is making your focus styles too subtle. I think we used to fall into that camp because we're like, oh, we don't like the ugly focus ring. So we wanted to make something that looked, kind of similar. We doubled up on our hover and focus effects a lot. But now we make more of a conscious effort to separate those out a little bit so that focus styles are free to be a lot more clear for people who really need them. And hover effects, while we still try to, you still want to do more than just a color only change, we kind of make those a little more subtle because that's only for mouse users. And that's usually accompanied by a cursor change, such as the pointer versus default. So they already kind of have a built-in form change in that regard as well, if they're using mouse or trackpad. So I think the one fallback of this one is it's not really good at detecting with form inputs. Because I mean, if you tab into a text field, you're going to have to type. So it kind of puts focus styles, focus visible classes on those inputs. As we didn't even think about that at first. And we're like, why is it doing that? We're like, oh, that actually makes sense. So some elements to keep in mind that will do that for. So, kind of all I have written up, but there's definitely more elements we can talk about. I don't know if we want to talk about the cookie banner or if you guys want to hear anything about WCAG 3.0, which is due to come out in another couple years with a lot of changes.
So how were these items identified as the things to focus on?
So our client had a third-party service do some evaluation and identified a lot of the higher level things, either based on level of like critical importance, or also here's some smaller things we can do that can result in some big wins. So like widespread fixes that are kind of contained in what the solution is. So we did a round of these a year or two ago, and we just did our second round this time around. But as far as with WCAG 2.1, the level 2s go, a lot of these are going to be measured against those criteria, which have 4 different types of things: the perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust categories, and each of those having elements within that are deemed the critical, very important, or kind of somewhat important elements. So that will change.
So you said the new WCAG is this summer. Is 3 farther in the future, or is this the case where they have 2 different competing standards?
The 2.2 is what's supposed to come out this summer. It has some other things other than focus visible in it, but it's basically additions and promotions of criteria within the same structure. 3.0 is going to be a complete overhaul. It's going to do a lot of changing in the way we evaluate accessibility. And also, I think kind of there's been a huge increase of like lawsuits and form letters going out for people who quickly run an automated accessibility test on your homepage and send you a letter threatening to sue if you don't fix the violations that are found, which in some ways that can be good because we want everyone to get better with accessibility, but one, automated tests aren't always accurate, and 2, it's kind of getting flooded with people doing that who aren't actually really having the problem. So I think it's becoming a little bit harder for people who have real disabilities and are encountering real issues to be taken seriously and have their voices heard without being seen as obnoxious and doing this for nothing kind of people. So 3.0 is going to be quite different. I'll be interested in seeing how evaluations change from that. So they released the draft form of it and how it is changing. They're actually going to be giving, the guidelines are going to be completely changing. They're going to be doing away with the 1, 2, 3, 4 pour structure, and evaluation is going to change kind of from pass fail or like passes, but with exceptions, things that kind of just make your site look bad, even if it's very good. It's going to be a little bit more of finding critical errors and actually giving people a rating in different categories. So you could rate very high without actually having to have like 100% of everything right everywhere, which for those of us who work on Drupal sites, and there are content admins who will find a way to break what you're working on or what you provide them with. So it's kind of a little bit of a relief there for people who have just huge sites with a lot of admins and a lot of things going on hundreds and thousands of pages. So, yeah.
I have a question, if I could.
Mhm.
Just about the kind of adoption of this. So I think you hinted that this was a particular client that was very motivated to have you do this work. And I'm kind of curious, what your, RDG's position has kind of become, and what your, have you become a champion of this because your eyes are open after having kind of been exposed to how horrible things are for, visually impaired, for example? Are clients willing to pay for this if they don't have a specific reason to, that kind of thing? Like how has adoption been received, and are you pushing it, and how, and so on and so forth?
I'll give my perspective on it first, and I'll let Peg. It is a challenge. We have a really wide range of clients, both in the perspective of their budget, from the perspective of their market, the age of the site, their all those things. So for our clients that have things like, we have some that have government grant funded, they are very motivated to do this and will bring it to us. Or bigger corporations, same deal. Smaller organizations tend to be reactive, and we can advise that this is something that they should pay attention to, but we often see it in response to, okay, it's a crisis now. For new site builds, we are doing our best to treat this as just part of the process, that it's not something that is an optional add-on. It's the way the site should be built.
And
I'm saying that as a philosophy, not as something I'm claiming that we do 100% well.
Yeah. So in the case of like the animations, if I understand correctly, like part of the kind of mix in play is that now this site maintainer, the client site maintainer, has to upload 2 images, a static one and an animated one. So you're putting there's been probably a little bit of dynamics around that, where they're thinking they've got to do more work, and they've got to have their designer make 2 images and that kind of stuff. I would imagine, right?
I mean, in this particular client, I think, was happy to do that since they started by coming to us, but we have had other clients where we've done auditing and remediation for, where there's been proposed solutions that they chose to reject because they liked the way they were doing it. And so we did our best to adapt. We did our best to improve the way they were doing it, even though the best thing to do would have been to change it a lot more. So yeah, it definitely depends on the client, but yeah.
Auto playing video is a great example of that. That's the kind of thing that, especially if a client is coming to us with an external designer or an internal or their own designer, and they have a design in mind, and they say the main page is going to have this video that plays when someone goes there. You know, that's just fundamentally a problem.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, all of that is probably about what I expected, but yeah, good to hear all your perspectives.
A lot of these things will take work to implement, but are obviously enhancements. It's things like the auto playing video that can be perceived as a regression.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that are more difficult.
Well, I guess one final question that kind of leads into it, maybe for Ashley. I don't know who's most aware, but like, where do you see this going in terms of, at some point? Right now, you can get a nasty letter from somebody that may or may not really mean anything. But is there going to be a point in a future time that we can predict where you really have to build your site this way or suffer some consequences?
Well, there are already, so there's countries like Canada, and then in the EU, where there's already a lot more legislation that you can point to for this. The thing in the United States that people can point to is the ADA, which was kind of drafted in the early 90s. So it was before people were really thinking about web applications. So the issue was not only the ADA, not only the definition of what a disabled person is, which used to be, you had to be pretty darn disabled to be considered disabled and protected under it. But then the only way we've been able to actually figure out how the ADA applies to the web is through lawsuits. So there have been some outcomes, like with Domino's. I think they were trying to push, them and some other corporations have tried to push that, since the ADA says you need to supply equivalent content or function. They're saying, well, they can call us. If they can't use the website, they can call us, and that's equivalent function. There was an airline that actually, so the Supreme Court denied Domino's, so they had to do remediation. There was also an airline that made a completely separate site for people with disabilities. So they thought that was, okay, we made a way for them to do it, so it's fine. We can just keep doing whatever we want on our main site. That was also ruled against as separate but equal, and not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was deemed not a sufficient way to have your site or products be accessible. So I do definitely see us moving in a direction where people are going to push for, here's an inclusive product. There are some laws in place for some main things like airlines, transportation, that my hunch is that e-commerce will be next. Just because, especially, so much more online buying is happening nowadays. But United States is a little bit behind the ball as far as clearly defined legislation. So we'll probably keep doing things the lawsuit way, unfortunately. But it'll be interesting how 3.0 messes with that. That's going to kind of turn that on its head. As you see right here, it is not backwards compatible with the 2.0 versions. That's how different that they want it to be. So overall, I think they wanted to be a lot more helpful tool to make those inclusive products without people falling into the camps of like, I got to check all the boxes. I got to pass all the automated tests. You can have a really bad site pass automated tests.
And by the backwards compatibility in terms of the standard, just to make sure I'm clear on what you mean. So a site that is 100% 2.0 or 2.1 compliant won't necessarily be 3.0 compliant. That's what that means, right?
Yes.
And vice
So
versa, possibly.
yeah,
I'm
vice
sorry,
versa.
John, what?
Mhm.
Oh, vice versa, is that what you said?
Yeah, probably vice versa, because so you see here's the 2.2 draft, which is very similar to 2.1. Like I said, it basically has some criteria have been promoted in importance and some new criteria have been introduced. But all of these are different criteria that are under the 2.x versions of WCAG. So they're very specific testable criteria, and it's also a little dry and difficult to understand because they have to write them in a way that's universally provable and testable, which is how automated tests are kind of hooking into testing these with various levels of success depending on how well the automated tests are built. But the evaluation process in 3.0 is going to be very, very different. And they're going to be looking at different things that are similar to that, but they're not going to be going based on those same breakdown of criteria. And then there's going to be different categories where you get kind of a ranking, you know, like a star rating maybe. So you'll get different scores in different categories. So what's likely going to happen here as they develop this more is they're probably going to have a score on the scale in each category that they may consider pass, fail, or suable or not suable. But it's going to be very different, and I think will require a lot more manual real person testing than the 2.0 automated tools will to actually get more accurate results. So at least I'm hoping.
Right. And when you say suable, not suable, this is not something that is force of law, right? This is just something you can hold up and as a benchmark.
Yes, that currently lawsuits tend to be centered around the 2.x criteria because that's the specific thing. They're like, hey, ADA says you should look at WCAG as your guidelines. So since those are our guidelines, you're in violation of, you know, this, and this.
Mm-hmm.
And even though you might not really be, because sometimes you look and you're not actually in violation, it's just the automated test improperly diagnosed a problem. So that can just, that kind of makes it a headache for remediation, and also kind of training clients kind of get into that. I don't want a lawsuit. How can I make the errors go away? Which is not the way we want to go about it. We want to build the best inclusive product. So, but I think that kind of goes back to your, client adaptation. Some fall into, we want to make it better. Some fall into make the errors go away. And that's where we kind of sometimes have issues with, something might take a bigger budget, or this fix requires more of an overhaul than you want to commit to, or hey, it's not actually a problem because of these reasons. And they're like, okay, but make it go away anyway.
All right. Well, thank you very much for putting this together for us. Informative as always, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of stuff to update us on this time next year.
Was that article public on your site that she was referring to?
Oh, not yet. And we're actually probably going to break it out into a series. So
Okay.
we'll be publishing at least one this week. If you have a preference on which one to go first, let us know.
And as always, we'll be putting the information on this meeting on Meetup. I'm still looking to see if that's the best way of doing it, because browsing past meetings is not quite as clear as it should be. But that's the best I've come up with so far.